All right, a few words about Midgley and cultural relativism. Um, by the way, she calls it moral isolationism. Everybody else in the entire world calls it cultural relativism. Relativism. It's the same thing. I don't know why she uses terminology that varies from is different from everybody else. Anyways, cultural relativism. The idea that morality is relative to culture. Um, Before I get into cultural relativism, however, I want to say a quick word about individual relativism, which nobody addresses hardly ever, because, and there's a reason for that. It's because that idea is completely incoherent and nobody in their right mind would adopt such a theory, even though a lot of people do. But that's because they're being very uncritical. That's the only way I can put it. Individual relativism is the idea that every single person just decides for themselves what's, I decide for myself what's moral. You decide for yourself what's moral. Every person decides for their own self. This is an unworkable idea for a lot of reasons. Well, and the most obvious one is that ethics, morality is about the rules, the norms, the laws that that dictate our interpersonal interactions, how we relate to one another as a community, as a culture, as a society. And it cannot possibly be the case that everybody just gets to decide for themselves how that's going to happen. What? Everybody gets to make their own rules? I mean, it's absurd. It's ridiculous. If you think about it for even a few minutes, you'll realize that can't be. Because what if this guy over here wants to rape and murder and rob people? Are you going to say, well, that's what he decided to do? No, that's not okay. It cannot. If this is the rules that we live by together, we can't have every single person making their own rules. That's anarchy and chaos, and I mean, it's absurd. A lot of people, like I said, a lot of people say this and they do it because they're like, yeah, morals, people disagree, and there's a lot of disagreement, and then they just throw up their hands and say, well, it just must be a personal taste kind of thing, or personal opinion kind of thing. Well, that's just being intellectually lazy, because that is, you don't really believe that. As soon as you start to think through the consequences of that being the case, no one's going to agree to the fact that everybody can just make up their own freaking idea of what's moral and not. And, like I said, if you want to rape and murder people, that's okay. No, you can't just have people deciding on their own what is moral and what is not. And so I hope I don't see this a lot in this class, because it does really bother me when people say, well, it's just all a personal opinion. It can't be. All right, think about it a little harder. It cannot possibly be that. That's just not thinking things through enough. What much more plausible, however, is cultural relativism. And that is to say that morality and ethics is dictated by your culture, where you live. Midgley's essay is pretty good. I'm not going to cover every single point again, but I'll go through some of the highlights. Okay, so morality is determined by the culture in which you live. Now, on the surface of it, to start with, that is definitely true. I mean, come on. What is moral and immoral in the ethics of one culture versus another do vary. I mean, across the world and across time, ethics vary by culture. They do. And this is not really the crucial issue. It is true that happens, but the bigger question is, so that happens, can I criticize someone living in another culture? Like, You know, can I criticize someone living in China or the Middle East or even Europe or something? Um, in other words, yeah, it varies, but am I allowed to say anything about another culture? Can I criticize what they're doing? Can they criticize what I'm doing? This is why she calls it moral isolationism. It's the notion that since it's culturally relative ethics, it is impossible to criticize someone from another culture because you don't know their culture, and the ethics is embedded in their culture, and you can't understand their culture, and therefore you cannot criticize their culture. And this is what Midgley is trying to argue against. Again, this is an argument against cultural relativism. The notion that you cannot understand another culture and therefore you can't criticize it, that, she says, is just not true. I mean, that is a false idea. You can, according to Midgley, you can absolutely criticize other cultures because you can understand other cultures. One of the things she brings up many times in this is that if you can't judge what other cultures are doing and you can't criticize what they're doing and you can't understand what they're doing, then that implies, obviously, that you cannot praise other cultures. You cannot say anything good about other cultures. If you can't say anything bad, you can't say anything good either because you don't understand it. So, and she says, and most people don't want to say that. They want to be able to point out things that are praiseworthy in other cultures, as well as things that are, blameworthy, I guess. Her example is trying out one's new sword. You can read that, what that means. It's a Japanese concept. So her arguments proceed to in this direction. Yes, it is absolutely possible to understand other cultures. A couple of other things I would like to emphasize here. And okay, so what I have, understanding has degrees. All right, here's one thing that is definitely true, however, and Midgley does address this a bit, but I really want to emphasize this point, and that is there are people that criticize other cultures and are way off base and clearly don't understand another culture. And that happens probably most of the time, to tell you the truth, people do have, I guess, knee-jerk reactions and criticize others without coming to any understanding of the other culture. They just make a quick snap judgment. That is wrong. Okay, that is wrong. It turns out that trying to criticize another culture actually takes some effort. It takes some work. You have to understand what their culture is about, why they have the norms and morals that they do, and that involves really trying to get to penetrate into the way they live and a lot of things. I mean, it takes some serious effort, and most people don't put that effort in, and that does lead you to think, well, people shouldn't criticize other cultures because most of the time they're idiots. And I acknowledge that fact, but I don't think I'm agreeing with Midgley that it is possible. You really have to work at it. I mean, you can't just make these snap quick judgments. You have to really try to understand where the other person's coming from, what their culture is about, and why they have the rules that they do have. It takes some effort, considerable effort sometimes. Depends on how foreign the culture is from you. I also, by the way, another thing that I really want to emphasize here, and Midgley doesn't bring this up, I don't think, or at least not prominently. One of the things that motivates people to want to um, endorse cultural relativism is the idea of tolerance. I think she does mention this, but anyway, the idea of tolerance. We should be tolerant of other cultures and other people and different ways and their different beliefs and ways of life. I totally agree with that idea. Tolerance is good, and I believe Midgley does too. But again, be careful what you think about this. If you say tolerance is a value that we should uphold, you're not saying that tolerance is a value my culture has and other cultures can have a different value. You're saying tolerance is a value that I should have in my culture, but you should have it in your culture too, and other cultures should have it, because you're not putting that out as a relativist, being relative. It's not a relative idea. Tolerance is a universal ethical principle that you're putting out there, saying people should tolerate one another, whatever culture they come from. But that's not relative, right? Think about it. That's not a relative idea. That is a universal idea. You're saying people should tolerate each other. So that's not cultural relativism. Again, I endorse that idea, but it isn't. It actually is not it's actually opposed to this view of cultural relativism, because you're saying this is a value that everyone should have. Similar with things like human rights and other things. Those people hold up as universal ethical values that span between cultures. If you believe in those kinds of things, and you don't believe in this theory, because this theory is saying that everything is relative to culture. Again, it's not Midgley's theory. She's arguing against it. Remember that. Not Midgley's theory. She is saying it's not a good theory. All right, one last thing that I find very interesting that she gets to kind of towards the end. I won't even scroll up my notes here, but how do you divide the world into cultures? That is kind of an interesting question. Do we in the West Coast live in a different culture than they do in the Midwest or in the South or on the East Coast of the United States? Or is the United States just one culture? And also, she also mentions that every culture on Earth has been influenced by every other culture on Earth, or many cultures on Earth, all through history, as people trade, invade, intermingle. Cultures are never isolated. They keep mixing, and they have been ever since the beginning of time, pretty much. I mean, even if you're a really white guy like me, I mean, my name is Scottish. I'm not really pure Scottish, but I'm a pure white guy. But if you look at just like the British Islands, how many people have invaded the British Islands over the last couple of thousand years? I mean, there was the Anglos and the Saxons and the Romans and the Normans. Nowhere is culturally isolated. People are constantly exchanging ideas. And it's more true than ever, of course, with modern technology. So how do you delineate a culture? Like, it seems like it's an arbitrary thing that's very difficult to pin down. What's one culture, what's another? And who cares, really, because they're all intermixing all the time anyways. Okay, so Midgley tries to stamp down this idea of cultural relativism. I think her arguments are quite good, but there are serious people that hold this view. So, pay some attention, see what you think.